Thank you, everybody. This is the last session before lunch. So one thing that I will do is make sure that we stay on time. So I have two roles. One is to moderate this session, and the other is to provide gender balance to this panel. So that is a special privilege for me, especially because this is a really, really esteemed set of colleagues. We've already gotten well into the issues of climate change. We know the context. The latest IPCC report assessment is absolutely clear. Climate change is occurring, accelerating at a pace that is far greater than we had anticipated. Its impacts are severe and falling particularly on poor countries and poor people. And the time to act is shrinking very rapidly. Within that, energy transition is absolutely center stage. And in two ways, energy is the lifeblood of development. We shouldn't forget that. That's the basis. And it is particularly the basis for inclusive development, and within that, the empowerment of women. So that's the good side of the energy side. On the other hand, if we fail to move to low carbon energy soon, we will irrevocably lose the climate goals, especially because we are approaching some tipping points that are really unknown and dangerous. That's the context. The question before us is, what is the role of the G20 and COP28? That's what I want this panel to focus on, because that's the title, especially at a time which is very crucial. So coming out of this conversation, I really would like a sense of what do we feel are the priorities at this point in time in terms of context. So let me just put two framing points on the table. One is, paradoxically, acting on energy transition is really the basis of what Amitabh Kant called inclusive, sustainable, resilient growth. Because of new technologies and because of the core benefits of acting on climate, such as health, less pollution, better, more compact cities, as we were talking about, better utilization of energy, a less wasteful way, less harmful way. So if we act on it, we actually can get to a better place and far away from the polluting, harmful growth model of the 20th century. That's the possibility that we have in our hand. But there are two issues. One is, in order to do that, we will need to invest and invest rapidly at scale, and that requires both good policies, but also a lot of finance. And in the developing countries at this point in time, finance and cost of capital is a big impediment. And second, we should be honest. We should recognize that energy transition will entail transitional costs. It will require, for example, carbon pricing to happen. Carbon pricing can be regressive. We have to take that into account. We have to ensure, for example, that those who are displaced in terms of employment from fossil fuels will be affected. And I'm sure that Noura Mansouri will talk about entire economies that are fossil fuel based and that have to be whose whole transition has to be a just transition. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. I'm just going to go in this order. It's easier that way. So I'm going to just begin with you, Noura. You were in the helm in the Saudi Arabian chair of the T20 when these issues were being discussed. You've been discussing it for a while. And you are coming at it, as I said, from a fossil fuel economy. So it would be very interesting to start with your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Amar. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for setting the scene on this very important issue. If we zoom back to when the G20 was established, finance has always been at the heart of it. And if we think about climate change, and particularly participating in climate mitigation by developing countries, finance is always the condition. So as we zoom into G20 India and the UAE COP28, but also last year, G20 Indonesia and COP27 in Egypt, we see that the Global South has taken the stage. And in doing so, it is an opportune time not only to address developing countries' needs, but also advance these narratives. And climate finance is always at the heart of the Global South and the conditions and requirements of the Global South. So climate finance, along with technology transfer and capacity building, is at the heart of climate mitigation, and particularly participating in climate mitigation by developing countries. Now, the new collective quantitative goal, which is the new goal for post-2025, replaces the $100 billion. And over here, we have to take a moment to acknowledge climate governance, its resilience, as well as its sustainability, but also the question of the trust deficit that developing countries interpret from this, because the very existing of the new collective quantified goal of finance is due to the failure of developed countries to deliver. And we have to take that into consideration. We have to take a moment to interpret the lessons learned from this failure and ensure that developing countries' priorities and needs are reflected in the new collective goal of finance. Similarly, the Kyoto Protocol was superseded by the Paris Agreement. So we have to take all of this into consideration and allow ourselves to interpret the lessons learned from these failure of climate action, failure of climate governance, and replacing it with what works for everyone, listening from everyone, and ensuring a just energy transition and climate action. I want to take a moment here to talk about the recommendations and outcomes that come from climate negotiations, particularly on climate finance, that must fall in the bounds of the principles of UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and ensure this continuity and agreement as we go, particularly the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, respective capacity, and equity, and ensure that whatever we agree on going forward, particularly and very timely as we get into COP28 and the G20, that we agree and reflect developing countries' narrative, particularly Article 2.2, which is on common but differentiated responsibility, and Article 4.5 and Article 9, to frame the discussion and the outcomes on what has been agreed on rather than start anew every time. So this continuity is very important, and particularly on the finance issue, since you're asking, Amar, on what needs to be done by G20 and COP28, is to align, I would say, all the international platforms and align the objectives in terms of advancing the climate finance issues. There are some thorny issues that needs to be resolved before the operationalization of the new climate goal by next year, by 2024, which is the date of the technical dialogue delivery, is to set the quantum in a manner that reflects the priorities and the needs of developing countries, the need for recurring methodology to determine the and assess the needs of the developing countries, and incorporate finance gaps of the developed countries, and establish strong accountability and transparency arrangement for developing countries. And I'll leave it with that, and I'll pass it on to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Noura. I'm sure we'll come back to this as a recurring theme. If I could turn to Saranjali Tandon, same question, but as I said, if you could push the boundaries on particularly what your asks would be for the G20 and the COP28.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. I think G20 gives a unique opportunity to ask uncomfortable questions that carry into COP28. I think we've spoken a lot about coal. It's time we bring the agenda back to all fossil fuels, which was brought up at the previous COP, but strangely disappeared in conversation. So I think it's extremely important to do that. I think the other thing is that every COP, another $1 trillion are thrown at everyone as a number. I don't know what to do with $4 to $6 trillion being required by countries. I think it's important to create a tracking device in a sense that across countries, what is the private finance flow to activities? And we see that through numbers produced by organizations like Climate Policy Initiative. But in a sense, a tracking facility for finance to say how much is going for which activity and what remains unfunded. My guess is, of course, adaptation would be the least funded, and perhaps where does the money need to go? I think we've seen that even in the case of SDGs, which is a conversation within the G20 where there remains confusion on who's funding what, and linking the SDGs back to the transition conversation, which obviously was a talk at COP27 as well, with the incorporation of just transition within that conversation. And you talked about pricing. Interestingly, I think the elephant in the room is CBAM. So we all need to talk about what will happen to trade flows and what will happen to development and growth. And this is fundamental, I think, as an economist. It's a competitive global order. So we're going to compete on trade flows, we're going to compete on investments. And if we saw how the Inflation Reduction Act and EU's Green Deal worked out, it was a competitive scenario. Each country is offering its own set of incentives, and that shifts financial flows quite swiftly. How do developing countries fit within that framework to attract that pool of capital, which is again trillions of dollars, which we say we'll unlock for financing transition across countries? So I think those are the few topics I think can be discussed.
Thank you, Suranjali. On the last point, I think it's important to mention that the G7 have launched something called the Climate Club, and they are very keen that it be extended to the key emerging markets and developing countries. A lot of active discussions here underway in India. And the idea of a Climate Club is to move away from a punitive arrangement to a more cooperative arrangement. So the G20 could play a role in that regard. So let me now turn to Sehee-jeong. You are, of course, based in Korea, and you've been working on solutions. So be very interested in what solutions would you put to the G20 and to COP28?
Hello, everyone. I'm Sehee, and as introduced, I'm from Solutions for Our Climate. We work on policy solutions mostly. And I would like to start by saying that as many of us have seen from the IPCC report that came out in early March, the world is off the track for 1.5, and all countries have a different all countries are in a different stage of development and have different resources at hand, and will take a different approach to energy transition. But I feel that they should be unified on supporting the further action and ambition for clean energy transition to prepare for tomorrow's climate disasters. So as we approach the midpoint of this critical decade, this year's G20 and COP28 have an even more pressure and responsibility to change the course of energy transition. And we need governments to build the political conditions for ambitious climate agreements at COP28, such as around setting a global renewables target. And G20, especially India's presidency, is very well placed to do that, given its strong leadership in renewables, especially solar. And G20 should serve as a platform to create a common message and language for energy transition fueled by renewables ahead of COP. And it's focused on also people-centered transition, including gender-inclusive policies, will be a critical milestone to achieve a just and inclusive transition. I would like to expand on these points in the subsequent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Say. Last but certainly not least, we have Viva Dhawan. She is the Director General of TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute. And, you cover all of these issues and more. So your perspectives, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And when we talk of this aspect of just transition and its commitments with the energy transition in India, it's absolutely clear because the kind of commitments the Honorable Prime Minister had made at Glasgow, it is very clear that we want to move in that direction of going green as much as possible with targets set for Indian industry and India as a whole. And if we look back, like the concept of just transition, perhaps it has its roots in the key principles of Article 3 of UNFCCC. And I'll read it, which, of course, there are lots of principles, but response to climate change should be integrated with social and economic development and recognize the specific needs of developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of the climate change. So it is something that when we look at the impact of the climate change, and you rightly mentioned in the beginning that those countries, developing economies, perhaps are going to be worst hit due to the changing climate. Now, we cannot divorce the societal development. Very rightly mentioned, the country has to develop. And we are still saying India is developing and developing at a very fast pace. And we cannot leave the rural communities behind either. So for us, energy transition is important for the rural communities as much as the industries. We also have to look into that as a country, quite a bit of our production that comes from small and medium enterprises. So we are not really looking at energy transition, which means different to different people. Like I'll say, for a rural community, a rural household, access to clean energy is energy transition. And again, because that's going to take care somewhere of their health, time that they otherwise spend in collecting wood at the moment. And so there is going to be a total change. The other thing I would also like to bring that when we talk of energy transition away from the fossil fuel-based energy, its impact on life and livelihoods of large section of population of G20 countries. And because 4 of the highest fossil fuel users, they fall in G20 countries. So a people-centered approach that ensures that the costs involved in the transformation of our energy system are distributed fairly and in a way that protects the most vulnerable section of the society. And it's also, if we look at climate justice, the term which is time and again used in our country, because we have so many which are getting impacted, and for them, the impact perhaps is going to cost them a generation. So we really need to be very sensitive, and that is the agenda of G20 and COP28. We also need to do the stock taking and move towards a plan, energy transition plan that supports the marginalized population, also ensures that we are looking at the social aspect of it. What kind of jobs will be created for them? What kind of skilling is required for them, and so on. Now, it's, again, because we talk of the climate finance and the numbers which perhaps the promises which are never met and numbers going up, but somewhere the developed part of the world also has to realize that we only have one planet to live in. So what is happening in one part of the globe is going to impact them sooner or later. So you might say that right now this is what is the AQI, but maybe in years it's going to go up. And therefore, this particular G20, we are looking apart from the countries of G20, and one is also looking at what are the needs. So, which becomes very important. The richer nations in the G20, perhaps they can provide support to developing countries through mechanisms like GCF. And I'll say more than the funds, what is also required is the exchange of technology. And because it's not just IPRs that your technology, yes, you have spent a lot of money to develop that technology, it is benefiting you, but if you are not reaching everyone, you are missing the bus. So that technology exchange as well as technology co-development, because the technology which is required for large industries is going to be little different from the needs of small and medium enterprises. And once you take them as partners in developing the technologies, then there will be less of teething problems and you will be able to implement it practically immediately. At TERI, of course, we are working very closely, I should say, with all stakeholders. We always believe that all stakeholders are contributing to climate change or the way we are using energy, and each stakeholder is getting impacted. So it's best to work with all of them. We have this, so we work with the rural communities on improved cook stoves, biomass-based gasification, and a number of other technologies. But we also have industry charter for net zero emission. So 50 industries they have signed, and we are working towards finding solutions together. And we also have a very strong partnership with Shell, where we are basically working on developing a scenario sketch for outlining the options and choices towards developing a technically possible and challenging net zero energy system for India. And of course, we are also looking forward to that we try to work with the cluster of industries with similar objective and work on long-term problems, as well as taking the research results or the best examples which we can adopt from anywhere in the world and take them to the end users. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. We've done remarkably well on time. So that means you get to answer more questions. So I'm going to put a few questions, just to be, to put some provocative ideas. Is the G20 the place to agree on principles for energy transition that hold countries to account and that ensure people-centric energy transition? Is that a function that the G20 can play? And, is the Indian G20, effort to get principles of people-centric energy transition a way to push that boundary? Second, on the perennial question of finance, as Noura said, we need to restore trust by delivering on the 100 billion, but we know that emerging markets and developing countries will need external finance in the order of $1 trillion a year. So what should the priorities be for the G20 in taking it from this level to that level? And as Amitabh Kant pointed out very eloquently, this is the year to get that commitment on resources, so particularly. And the third is, as you said, Viva, for poor people, access to clean energy is the energy transition. But, poor people are also affected if energy costs become high. And at this moment, particularly after the effects of the war on energy prices, the biggest opportunity and challenge is a massive, massive scale-up of renewables everywhere on the planet. What would it take to deliver on that, and what is the role of the G20? So you can take your pick, but I thought I should just put some questions, and I'll maybe just go in the same order.
Thank you, Ammar. Very interesting questions. So for the first one, I mean, if we consider multilateralism and the international platforms that are there, I think alignment is important. So the G20 has a role, the COP has a role, but all these international platforms should align on matters that matters most and should create the momentum. And in the couple of years, last year and this year, the Global South has been at the heart of this, simply because, you know, as we said, G20 happens here in India. It was in Indonesia last year, the COP as well, Egypt and the UAE. So the narrative of the developing countries has to be highlighted, has to be advanced, and we want to see progress on matters that developing countries have, particularly the trust deficit that we talked about, and how can we restore the trust to ensure climate action that's realistic and also progressive. You talk about people-centered energy transition, and I think this is key because, you know, people-centered energy transition is really about truly fair and inclusive energy transition. And I'm very intrigued by what Viba said about energy access and energy transition. So every nation has its story, and every country has its own energy transition pathway. It could be energy access for developing countries, and it could be transitioning to renewable energy in other countries. So the national circumstances of every country has to be taken into consideration, and so is the resources endowment. Sustainability transition pathway will mean different for every country, and we should keep all the energy options open and allow countries to transition with climate justice in mind. So the climate budget, the remaining climate budget, is certainly not equal for all countries. Developing countries should have a larger remaining carbon budget to give space for their development, to give space for their smooth energy transition towards sustainability. And climate finance comes here, as discussed previously, at the heart of all of this. After all, the principles of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement preserves that right for developing countries, preserves the right to emit, and preserves the right to use climate finance in order to participate in climate mitigation, as they're already burdened by climate adaptation and will need technology transfer, capacity building, but also climate finance. And I'll leave it here, and perhaps we'll have another chance at discussing this.
Thank you. So you go next.
Thank you so much. I think G20 is a smaller club. COP28 has many more countries, and G20 could be a test bed for ideas. I think one thing which other speakers have also spoken of is just to agree on the principle that no one's left behind, which underscores common but differentiated responsibility, and also underscores having just transition within countries. I think one thing missing at COP, which is very much there at G20, is that we talk macroeconomics. At COP, we do not talk about savings rate. We do not talk about debt levels. And I think that needs to be brought within COP, because solutions across countries to any problem is that we'll create another fund, and then we'll wait for people to pool that fund. I think it has to come from within as well. And perhaps the conversation on what kind of debt relief will be available to countries, which of course also requires the IMF and World Bank to be part of the conversation, but what kind of debt reliefs exist, what kind of sovereign ratings will be assigned to countries so that they have access to finance, I think, and also how to push up savings rates, which translate into investment in economies, need to be spoken of within the COP framework, which can build on G20's work.
I think that's an extremely important point, which is finance is really too important and too cross-cutting to just leave to COP28. And there's a nice synergy between the two. And it's interesting because, about 7-8 years ago, it was taboo for the G20 to talk about climate and climate finance. So we made quite a lot of progress. Sehi?
Yes, so I think G20 is coming at a very critical time to set the tone and scene for renewables. I keep talking about this, but I think G20 and COP28 this year will be a very good opportunity for this discussion to really kick off. As you know, climate ministers from 43 countries met in Copenhagen a month ago for the first high-level meeting after COP27, and renewables expansion was a big part of the discussion. That maybe for the first time in the COP process, we will be able to have something in text that ends up, fixing in the specific targets on renewables. And almost 200 countries would need to agree on the goal unanimously, which will be very tough. But setting a renewable target would be a very important signal to send to the countries and both, the global north and south, but also to the markets. And also just last week in the Petersburg climate dialogue, Mr. Al-Jaber, the COP28 president, urged the countries to accelerate delivery in sectors like renewables that must triple capacity by 2030 and triple it by 2040. So this message will likely be echoed in the upcoming climate moments up until COP28 and G7 and other moments. And in particular, I think the G20 presidency, Indian presidency, can be a strong voice for advocating for such a target on renewables. To send the right signals to the renewables market, so it helps setting a global renewables target with stronger accountability and which is on the pathway for a clean economic transformation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Viva?
Yeah, thank you so much. Lots has been said, so it becomes a little difficult to be the last one speaking on this subject. But I look at that India's presidency of G20, that gives us a crucial platform to shape global dialogue. And especially when it is the policies that what we are discussing here and the kind of emphasis that has been given to G20 by India. So it's going to be very well-researched kind of outcomes that one is going to suggest or put forward in COP. And COP is also being held in Asia. It's in Dubai. So that way, we do hope that we'll find a place to present what is required and how to go about. Now, the other problem is that, or I'll talk both of problems and the opportunities. Now, when we are talking of energy transition, so somewhere it is that when we talk of carbon credits, there are going to be number of technologies which will take care of on their own. Like, for example, if you are going for afforestation program or if you are going for improved cook stoves, if it is well documented, you can get carbon credits from the other countries as well. So that can become one method of financing. So you are not looking for mega finance, you are basically looking at small projects based on the technologies that you are adopting. One thing which also becomes a challenge is that you are talking of new regulations, like European regulations for the shipping industry. Now, ships, they have to go. All countries, they have different standards today. And therefore, will they be further penalized that they have the old technologies? So one will also have to be very careful of international regulations that are emerging. And that is where I'll say there can be no better forum than G20, because then it's the collective voice that what can be done and what cannot be done.
Thank you, Eva. And this is actually a very important year in terms of climate finance discussion. I agree very much with the sentiment that it's the G20 that is best placed to kind of lead and put coherence. We will, there's been a big push at the political level through something called the Bridgetown Initiative, which has brought in the perspectives, particularly of vulnerable countries, very important. We will have a big summit in Paris, June 20th. Well, we'll have the G7 on the 19th and 21st, and many of us are pressing that the G7 really do need to resume their leadership on climate finance, which has been missing for the past couple years. There will be the Paris Summit, June 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and then the G20 finance ministers, the G20 leaders, ending with COP28. So we have 2 days in which to come up with good suggestions for that. I think this panel has given some ideas, but we have a few minutes to see if anybody thinks, have we missed big takeaways that we need to. So I'm just going to, I see mostly male hands, which isn't good. We need to get the gender balance back. But I will begin with the male hand right here. And if you could make yours a really brief question.
Hello, my name is Igor Makarov. I work at the High School of Economics in Moscow. My question is about consumption-based emission approach to emissions accounting is an alternative to production-based approach to emission accounting. My short question is whether do you think that it makes sense to encourage countries to set targets based on consumption-based emissions along, not instead, of course, production-based emissions, and to which extent G20 may be the driver of this process? Thank you.
Yes, the gentleman here.
Sir, I have two short issues. One is I want to know about any finance at the large scale on innovation development process. And second is any strategy on finance utilization.
The gentleman over there, right here.
A lot of discussion took place on COP27 and the loss and damages. So to draw the attention to the loss and damages fund. But the COP27 couldn't agree, or there weren't discussions about how the finance will be taken care of for the loss and damages fund. So what solutions do you foresee? Actually, I represent Cuts International, and we are part of this campaign. We are arguing for a universal financial transaction tax. If G20 could be a platform like it was a platform for the corporate tax and financial transaction tax, the proceeds of which could go to the COP26 loss and damages fund. So your thoughts on it?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just take the lady over there.
My name is Akanksha Varade. I'm a chemical engineer. So my question was specifically to Vibha ma'am, since you represent TERI. If we see around us, the major green hydrogen projects are currently going on in countries like Germany, Canada, Australia. So the projects in India are still at like pilot level. We have recently launched them. So do you think G20 can serve as a platform to formulate policies for tech transfer? Like we can, like as we have ASSOCHAM, FICCI with us in India. So similarly, can we collaborate with commerce chambers there or industrial chambers there to come together?
Thank you. We got the question, so I'm just going to let them answer. Viva, you go first.
Okay, well, you are aware of the hydrogen mission, which was announced by the Prime Minister on Independence Day. And what we are essentially doing at the moment, there are large groups working on what should be the policy of the country. MNRE is leading this initiative. And it is very difficult for MNRE or anyone to say we'll buy the technology from Germany or tech transfer from Germany, because there are many players. So what one is intending to do over there, that should we set up Center of Excellence, what kind of collaborations, which will be more institute-based? Because as nation, it's very difficult to say, go to country XYZ. It will be more on that. And also the hydrogen production, you are using different technologies, different usage, and it is not going to come from one country, but yes, international partnerships will be encouraged in that.
Thank you. Anybody else on the questions? Yes, Noura, go ahead.
Yes, I'll take up the question on loss and damage and maybe climate finance. So in COP27, one of the historic outcomes was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, and it was great for developing countries, as this, as you may know, has been blocked for decades, where countries were asked to use development funds instead of a dedicated loss and damage fund. And the COP28 job is to look into through the transitional committee to look into the sources of finance as one of the things that has to be achieved. On the climate finance front, the technical expert dialogue meeting over between 2022 and 2024. So we have one more year to finalize the new collective goal on finance, and hopefully we will see progress in COP28 as another thing that G20 can also push for, is to finalize this roadmap toward the new collective goal of finance. And one of the main issues is to choose the quantum, but also to have a recurring methodology to assess the development and priorities of developing countries, to assess how much is needed, and to not repeat the failure that happened with the $100 billion. So it is important that the world really interpret the lessons learned from this failure. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. And just on the question of consumption-based emission calculation, yeah, it absolutely should be part of the equation, but not only for emissions, but for resource intensity and resource use in general. I am not. There's discussions this year in the G20 around circular economy, but I'm not sure whether that is included or not. With that, I think we are over time and in time for lunch. So please join me in thanking the panel. I think it was excellent discussion. Thank you.